From the vaults of truth and tension, where silence often hides the heaviest stories, one storyteller invites you into a tale that refuses to be forgotten. With a century's worth of storytelling wisdom coursing through our voice, we deliver not just entertainment, but revelation. This isn't just a headline or a moment gone viral. This is a heartbeat paused in fear, a system stripped bare, and a man, respected, accomplished, and black, thrown to the pavement by those sworn to protect. He wasn't just any man. He was a federal prosecutor. Tonight, we unravel the chilling and intimate account of what happens when justice forgets the face of its own champion, when law sees only color, not credentials, when dignity is shattered on wet pavement and a city is forced to confront its reflection. This is not a story you hear. This is one you feel. This is Racist Cop Arrests the Wrong Black Man. He's a federal prosecutor. Brought to life only by A1 Storyteller, where truth is told with cinematic weight and soul-deep clarity. Let us begin. It was a gray Tuesday morning in Eastbrook, the kind of city where the air always seemed thick with something unsaid. Rain slipped down rooftops like whispered apologies, pooling in cracked sidewalks and glistening on the windshields of slowly moving cars. The city woke with a quiet reluctance. Coffee steam rising from stoops, the soft hum of buses on cracked streets, and the sigh of a tired world getting up once again to face itself. Through this muted symphony rolled a black BMW, slicing through the wet with elegant restraint. Inside, the cabin was warm, wrapped in the subtle scent of leather and cedar wood cologne. The driver's hands, steady and sure, rested at 10 and 2. Elijah Porter was in no rush, though time pressed all around him. His mind drifted between court dockets and closing arguments, but he kept his gaze steady, watching the red light ahead reflect in tiny rivulets racing across his windshield. He adjusted the knot of his navy tie, sharp against the crisp white of his shirt, his face calm but alert. To any observer, he was just a man on his way to work. But beneath that surface, Elijah was carrying more than just his briefcase. He carried the weight of legacy, the quiet ache of responsibility, and a fragile hope that maybe today would be different. Maybe today the world would see him not as a threat, not as a shadow to fear, but as what he truly was, a protector of justice, a son of this very soil, trying to make it better. The light turned green. He eased forward. Just another morning. Or so he thought. Elijah Porter didn't look like what Officer Darren Mills expected that morning, and that was part of the problem. His tailored suits, his measured voice, his degrees from Columbia and Howard. None of it fit the image that had been carved into Eastbrook's collective psyche about men who looked like him. Elijah had come back to the city, not to run from its ghosts, but to confront them. The projects he'd grown up in still stood, crumbling but breathing, filled with kids whose laughter masked hunger and whose futures were too often decided by zip code rather than ambition. Took on, every conviction he fought for was another stitch in the wound that had long festered between this city and the people it was supposed to serve. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was chasing dignity. For his mother, who worked double shifts at the clinic. For his brother, who never made it past 17. And for the boy he used to be, watching police lights flash outside his window like thunderclouds without warning. Elijah's heart beat to the rhythm of justice, but it also carried the weight of fear. Because no matter how high he climbed, no matter how many criminals he locked away, There was always a chance that a badge wouldn't see his name, only his skin. And on that morning, at that red light, Elijah Porter, federal prosecutor, hometown son, had no idea that today would test everything he believed about justice and whether it truly could see a man like him. The wipers glided rhythmically across the windshield as Elijah took a careful right turn at the corner of Jefferson and Langston. A harmless maneuver, done with full awareness of the street signs and signals. It was something he had done hundreds of times. Precise, lawful, methodical, just like everything else in his life. But in Eastbrook, precision didn't always protect. A parked cruiser, nondescript and idling at the side of the street, flickered to life.
"Shield him." Behind him, Officer Darren Mills stepped out of the patrol car with a kind of practiced swagger. Mills was built like a man who expected to be obeyed. Stocky, clenched jaw, the weathered face of someone who had long since stopped questioning the authority he wielded. The badge on his chest gleamed, but there was no grace in the way he approached, only entitlement. He adjusted his belt as he walked, resting one hand on his sidearm. The other curled around the flashlight he didn't need. There was daylight, clear visibility. But still, the flashlight came out, tapping gently against his thigh as he stepped closer to Elijah's vehicle. Inside the BMW, Elijah rolled the window down, slowly, deliberately, like a man performing an old ritual, one whose outcome he already feared. The rain drizzled in lightly through the gap. Elijah glanced up, his voice even, respectful. "Good morning, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Mills didn't answer at first. His eyes traveled from Elijah's hands to his face, then down to the tailored suit, the leather briefcase on the passenger seat, the gleam of the wedding ring on his left hand. Everything about Elijah screamed order, success, belonging, but it was precisely that which seemed to agitate Mills. To him, Elijah wasn't where he was supposed to be. The car was too clean, the voice too calm, the gaze too direct. "You made an illegal turn," Mills said finally, his voice clipped. "Didn't see the sign?" "There was no sign prohibiting a ride on red," Elijah replied, still courteous. "I'm certain it was permitted." Mills took a slow breath, the kind people take when they've already decided the ending to a story and are only waiting for others to catch up. He leaned slightly toward the open window. A license and registration. Elijah nodded, moving with careful, exaggerated slowness as he retrieved his wallet and paperwork from the glove compartment. Every motion was deliberate, as if he were choreographing each second to appear non-threatening. He handed over the documents with a calm steadiness that came not from fear, but from a life lived navigating rooms that had never been built with him in mind. Mills took the documents, barely glancing at them. "You live around here?" "Yes, a few blocks down on Park Ridge." "I've lived in Eastbrook my whole life." "You a lawyer or something?" Mills squinted at the federal ID card Elijah had provided, as if trying to read a language foreign to him. The words United States Department of Justice didn't seem to register, or maybe they did, and that was the problem. "Well, I'm a federal prosecutor," Elijah said simply, without flourish. There was a beat of silence, sharp, loaded, and heavy. Something behind Mills' eyes narrowed, hardened, as if Elijah's very presence had become a provocation. His grip on the flashlight tightened. He looked again at the ID, then back at Elijah, as if trying to reconcile two images that refused to align in his mind. A step out of the vehicle, Mills said suddenly. Elijah blinked, caught off guard. Is there a problem, officer? I'd be happy to clarify. I said step out. Now. The shift was sudden. No explanation. No escalation. Just a command, sharp and brittle. Elijah hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of disbelief. This was not the first time he'd been pulled over. It wasn't even the 10th. But it was the first time someone had looked him square in the face, seen his badge, his title, his credentials, and still reached for control like it was a loaded weapon. May I ask on what grounds you're detaining me? Elijah asked, voice even, trying to slow the momentum. Drewy. Mills leaned in closer, and for a moment their eyes locked, one full of confusion and disbelief, the other thick with suspicion. You fit the description of a suspect from this morning. What suspect? Elijah asked quietly, but Mills didn't answer. He opened the door, uninvited, and tugged Elijah out of the car with practiced aggression. Elijah didn't resist. His muscles tensed instinctively, his body folding in anticipation of force. The briefcase spilled onto the wet asphalt. Legal briefs scattered like fallen leaves. The rain had picked up, steady and cold now, soaking through Elijah's dress shirt as he was shoved face first onto the hood of the car. The cold metal pressed against his cheek. He closed his eyes. Cuffs clamped tight around his wrists. The bite of steel dug into skin. His heartbeat pounded behind his eyes, not from panic, but from humiliation. The kind that comes when everything you've built, every sleepless night in law school, every conviction won in court, every Sunday sermon where your mother prayed for your safety, crumbles under the boot of someone who only sees your skin and their fear. A crowd had begun to gather. Slowly at first, 2 teenagers with phones, a man walking his dog, a mother pulling her child close as she crossed the street. Some stared, others filmed. And still, Elijah said nothing. He let the cuffs stay, let the rain fall, let the assumptions sit like stones in the air between them. Because he knew that if he raised his voice or tensed his body or even dared to question more forcefully, this encounter might not end with handcuffs. Mills radioed in something unintelligible, standing tall like a hunter with a fresh catch. Elijah turned his head slowly, rain dripping down the bridge of his nose, and looked up at the man who held his freedom hostage. He said nothing. Not yet. There would be a time for words, a time for clarity, a time for reckoning. But for now, there was only the rain, the cold, and the weight of everything unsaid. You fit the description of a suspect from this morning, Officer Mills repeated, almost triumphantly, like the phrase itself was a shield that made everything he'd just done permissible. Elijah, now fully soaked from the steady rainfall, salts from the steady rain, turned his head slowly against the cold steel of the BMW hood, water running down his temple. His jaw tightened, but he kept still. That sentence, those 6 words, had echoed across generations, carved into the bones of men who had not lived long enough to tell their side. He'd heard them as a child, whispered in barbershops and family kitchens. He'd seen them, scrawled in police reports, used as justification for cracked ribs, bruised faces, ruined lives. And now, with his own wrists locked in steel, Elijah was no longer just a prosecutor. In this moment, he was every black man whose dignity had been stripped by a uniform that claimed to serve and protect. Mills didn't explain what the description was. He didn't mention a time, a location, or a suspect profile, because he didn't have to. The silence was louder than specifics. The implication clear: a black man in a nice car, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, doing nothing but existing. Elijah's briefcase still lay open on the pavement, its contents scattered, legal documents now soaked through, pages of indictments and deposition transcripts fluttering slightly in the breeze, rendered useless by the elements. His name was on half of them, his signature, his title. None of it mattered. A second patrol car pulled up behind them. Officer Sanchez, younger, leaner, with tired eyes, stepped out and approached the scene. He slowed as he recognized Elijah, the cuffs, the rain-slicked papers, his brow furrowed. Something in him shifted. "Mills, what's going on here?" he asked cautiously. "Got a match on a suspect from this morning's report. Pulled him over after a suspicious turn," Mills replied, voice firm, as if daring anyone to question his narrative. Sanchez looked again at Elijah, and his jaw tensed subtly. He recognized the face. Not from mugshots or police briefings, but from television interviews, press conferences, community events. He had once seen Elijah speak at a police community outreach summit, his voice echoing through City Hall with measured brilliance. Sanchez didn't say anything, but his eyes gave it away. Mills noticed. "You know this guy?" Mills asked. Sanchez hesitated. He knew better than to answer immediately. Mills was senior, respected in some circles, feared in others. A man with friends in high places and a long history of just barely skating past misconduct inquiries. But Sanchez also knew what he saw in front of him didn't add up. "Oh, think he's, a federal attorney or something," Sanchez said slowly, picking his words like stepping stones over a minefield. "He says that," Mills grunted, motioning toward the ID still in his pocket. "Or could be fake. You know these people. Always got a story." Elijah didn't flinch, though the words sliced through him. These people. He had spent his life outrunning those two words, studying harder, speaking clearer, dressing better, smiling when it wasn't asked. All to make sure that when people saw him, they didn't see those people. And yet here he was, shackled and dripping, reduced to nothing more than skin and silhouette in the eyes of a man with a badge. A small group had started to gather on the other side of the street. A teenager with braids held up his phone, filming silently. An older woman under a red umbrella shook her head, muttering beneath her breath. The atmosphere was thick with unease, the kind that precedes a storm. But the storm had already come. Elijah said nothing, not because he didn't have words. He had too many. But he knew the weight of silence. In a courtroom, he had used it as a weapon, letting a pause after a statement land like a blow. Here, silence was his defense, his protest, his shield. He didn't beg, didn't plead, didn't argue. He let the cuffs speak, let the scattered pages speak, let the disbelief on Sanchez's face speak. Mills pulled Elijah away from the car and began marching him toward the patrol vehicle, hand on his back like he was guiding a criminal rather than dragging a professional through the mud. Elijah kept his steps measured, the water in his shoes squelched with every move, each step a reminder of how quickly power could twist the truth. "Watch your head," Mills muttered, shoving Elijah into the back seat with more force than necessary. The door slammed. Elijah sat stiffly, cuffs biting into his wrists, water pooling around his ankles. He could barely hear the conversation outside over the blood rushing in his ears. Sanchez was saying something, low and tense. Mills cut him off. There was a hierarchy at play, unspoken but well understood. Mills was the kind of officer who didn't like his authority questioned, and Elijah could see it now in Sanchez's expression. The unease, the reluctance, the slow, grudging acceptance that even if something felt wrong, the cost of speaking out might be higher than the benefit. The patrol car began to move. The radio crackled softly in the background. Rain streaked across the windows in chaotic lines, blurring the world outside like tears smeared across glass. Elijah stared straight ahead. He wasn't afraid. He was angry. But deeper than that was something heavier. Deeper than that was something heavier. A sorrow that sat behind his sternum like lead. Not for himself, but for everything this moment confirmed. That it didn't matter who he was. That no amount of success or service or status could immunize him from suspicion. That there were still men with guns and uniforms who could press him into the dirt and call it procedure. They pulled into the Eastbrook precinct's rear lot. Mills yanked open the door and pulled Elijah out with practiced, indifferent efficiency. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glare on the worn tile floors and gray walls. The intake sergeant barely looked up until Mills threw Elijah's ID onto the counter. The suspicious suspect. Possible fraud. Illegal turn. Mills said casually. The sergeant picked up the ID, turned it over in his fingers, and frowned. This says he's with the DOJ. Yeah, Mills muttered, already turning to fill out the report. He says a lot of things. Elijah stood silently, cuffs still tight. The sergeant looked up, properly this time, and his expression shifted. Recognition flickered behind his eyes. Secrets behind his eyes. He didn't say anything, not right away, but he watched Elijah with a kind of quiet dread, as if realizing something had gone terribly wrong, but not knowing how to unwind it. They placed Elijah in a holding room, not a cell, but cold and impersonal, all the same. He sat on the edge of a metal bench, water dripping from his cuffs to the floor. His watch was gone. His dignity felt far behind him, scattered in pieces on Jefferson Avenue. Time moved strangely. Minutes stretched. Conversations outside the door floated in like echoes, muffled and chaotic. Then the door opened with a sharp click. Ada Marla Reyes stepped inside, heels clicking, her coat still damp from the rain. Her face was fire and disbelief, fury held together by a strand of professional restraint. She looked at Elijah, and for a second, her mouth parted as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Elijah," she said, and her voice cracked, not out of weakness, but out of shock. He gave a small nod. No bitterness, just resignation. "What the hell happened?" she asked, looking to the officer behind her. The officer, a detective Elijah didn't recognize, fumbled for words. "There was a stop," Officer Mills said. "We didn't know." "You didn't know?" She cut in. "You had his DOJ credentials, his ID, his face, and you dragged him in here like he's some street thug." The detective swallowed. "It was a misunderstanding." No, a misunderstanding is forgetting someone's coffee order. This," she gestured to Elijah's soaked suit, the bruising on his wrists, the scattered paperwork on the table. This is what happens when bias wears a badge. Outside, voices were rising. Word was spreading fast. Someone had leaked the video. Social media notifications began pinging in real time on phones throughout the department. The footage, Elijah being pulled from the car, cuffed, held against the hood, was already being dissected, commented on, and shared. Elijah remained seated, calm though his eyes met Marla's now. She saw something in them she hadn't before, a quiet edge. Not rage, not vengeance, but purpose. She turned to the officer behind her. "Get those cuffs off him. Now." The officer hesitated, then moved quickly. The metal snapped open. Elijah flexed his fingers slightly, circulation returning in slow pulses. He stood slowly, not like a man released, but like one rising from beneath something heavy and ancient. Elijah stood in the narrow holding room, rain still dripping from the hem of his slacks, as he rubbed the deep red marks where the cuffs had bitten into his wrists. The silence between him and Marla was thick, two colleagues now separated by a line neither had expected to cross. She handed him a towel, something grabbed from a locker room down the hall, and he accepted it with a nod, drying his hands first, then his face, with a slow precision that masked the tremor in his fingers. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, each syllable measured. I told him who I was. I told him who I was. Showed him my credentials. It didn't matter. Marla closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling sharply through her nose. There was no policy for this. No briefing in law school or the prosecutor's office that prepared them for what to do when the system mistook one of its own for the enemy. She'd seen injustice, had prosecuted it. But now, seeing Elijah, someone she admired, someone who'd spent his life holding others accountable, reduced to just another body in the system, she felt something deeper, shame. Down the hall, murmurs rose. The precinct was no longer a bubble. The video was out. An officer from Internal Affairs had arrived, clipboard in hand, face unreadable. Mills was being pulled into a conference room, his swagger now replaced with confusion, then irritation as the reality of his mistake began to close in. Elijah watched it all from the far end of the hall, leaning lightly against the doorframe. His clothes were still damp, his dignity less so. Officers glanced at him and then away. No one apologized, not yet, but silence had begun to rot into discomfort and discomfort into guilt. Marla stood beside him, folding her arms across her chest, eyes tracking the hurried movement of officers pretending to have something urgent to do. Then she turned to Elijah, voice quiet. "What do you want to do?" He didn't answer immediately. The question wasn't small. It wasn't just about charges or reports. It was about the weight of what had happened and how to hold it up to the light. How to show the city, not just what Officer Mills had done, but what systems had allowed it, encouraged it, protected it. Elijah looked down the corridor again, toward the room where Mills now sat under questioning. Then, slowly, his eyes returned to Marla's. Who they put in cuffs, who they dragged through the rain like a criminal. I want every young black boy in this city to know that no matter how many degrees you earn, how many laws you uphold, they still might try to reduce you to nothing. And I want them to see that you can stand anyway. The press conference room at the federal courthouse was packed, the low hum of reporters adjusting mics and rustling notepads swelling beneath the bright overhead lights. Elijah stepped up to the podium in a crisp navy suit, the bruises on his wrists now faint shadows but still present, visible proof of a system that had turned on its own. Cameras flashed. His eyes scanned the crowd, not for sympathy, but for understanding. He didn't need to convince them of what happened. The video had already done that, but he needed to remind them of what it meant. I was arrested, he began, voice clear, unwavering, and not because I broke the law, but because someone saw my skin and assumed I had. Behind him stood leaders from the DOJ, community activists, fellow prosecutors, and even a few police officers who had quietly reached out to say they were sorry. The weight of their presence was symbolic, but the truth remained heavier. Elijah laid out the facts with prosecutorial precision, how he was stopped without cause, how his ID was ignored, how silence replaced accountability until the footage made denial impossible. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for reckoning, for policy change, for body camera enforcement, implicit bias retraining, independent review boards with real power. He asked the public not to look away just because it happened to a man in a suit, because for those without titles, the story too often ends without a podium or a crowd. Outside the courthouse, the air felt electric, as if the city itself had paused to listen, to reckon with what had unfolded. A slow drizzle traced silver lines down windshields and concrete steps as Elijah stepped through the crowd, not flanked by officers this time, but by truth and its growing army. Protesters lined the sidewalk, holding signs that read, "Credentials weren't enough," DOJ, not a suspect, and justice looks like accountability. Some faces Elijah recognized. Law students he'd mentored, former clients, fellow attorneys. But most were strangers, people who had seen the video, felt the weight of its silence, and showed up because they knew this wasn't just about him. It was about what his arrest had unearthed. In neighborhoods across the city, conversations had ignited. In barbershops and bodegas, classrooms and courtrooms, people spoke Elijah's name not just as a symbol of injustice, but as a mirror held up to a system long overdue for reform. His face had been on the evening news, his story dissected on morning talk shows, analyzed on social media platforms, where young Black professionals shared their own quiet humiliations, being followed in stores, ignored in meetings, pulled over without reason. Elijah had become more than a prosecutor. He had become a living example of how success didn't shield you, and how dignity could still be dragged to the curb and left in the rain. In the DA office, the tone had changed. Whispers turned into meetings. The higher-ups, once quick to defend the status quo, began drafting memos about procedural reform. New task forces were proposed, designed to review racially biased stops. Elijah was asked to sit on one of them, and though part of him bristled at the sudden eagerness, born not of justice, but of fear, he agreed, because refusing would have meant letting them sweep it away, pretending it hadn't happened, that it wasn't happening still to people without microphones or federal badges. Marla brought him the first agenda draft, a thick stack of paper she placed on his desk with a weary smirk. "They want you to help clean the wound they made," she said. Elijah flipped through it, scanning words like commune-tie liaisons, disciplinary oversight, civilian accountability boards, half measures dressed in bureaucratic language. But something was better than silence. And change, even slow, was still change. He returned to court the following week, not as a defendant, not as a man wrongly accused, but in his original capacity, a prosecutor. The same bench, the same robe, but the atmosphere had shifted. Judges held their stares a second longer. Bailiffs nodded with quiet acknowledgement. Even defense attorneys who had once clashed with him now offered subtle nods, respect earned not just from the courtroom, but from surviving what many of them had known all too intimately. But nothing prepared Elijah for the letter. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address, slid under his office door one morning, just as the sun broke through the skyline. Inside, a single handwritten note. "I'm 15. I saw your story. I didn't think someone like you could get arrested. like that. I didn't think someone like me had a chance, but then I watched you speak, and I saw your eyes. You didn't look scared. You looked like you were still standing. I want to stand like that too. There was no name, no city. Just that single page folded once, the corner smudged with fingerprints that spoke of hope laced in pain. Elijah held it in his hands for a long time, longer than he realized. That small voice, scribbled in pencil, said more than 100 policy drafts or editorials ever could. It reminded him that even broken moments, when held to the light, could reflect something unbreakable. Officer Mills sat across from the internal review panel, a thin sheen of sweat on his brow as he fumbled through justifications that no longer held weight. The room was sterile, clinical, but the tension was thick. Clips of the body cam footage played on a loop beside him. Elijah identifying himself clearly, Mills ignoring it, the forceful arrest that followed. Each replay stripped away his defenses. He tried to lean on protocol, citing vague suspect similarities, but even those words rang hollow now. His badge sat on the table, not yet revoked, but heavier than ever. The panel listened in silence, their eyes not just on Mills, but on the legacy of unchecked power he represented. Meanwhile, the department released a public apology, carefully worded, too polished to feel sincere. It named the error, named Elijah, but stopped short of naming the disease. Still, public pressure mounted, and for the first time in years, city leadership couldn't look away. A case that began with rain and silence had grown into a storm. The city's annual Unity Summit was never meant to be more than a symbolic gesture, a conference room of polite applause, lukewarm coffee, and speeches written more for headlines than for hearts. But this year, it felt different. The auditorium was filled to capacity, not just with politicians and press, but with residents from every zip code. Teachers, students, retired veterans, janitors, public defenders, grocery clerks. People who had seen themselves in Elijah's story or had lived their own version of it without cameras to document the proof. The stage was modest, lit with soft amber tones, a single podium at center. And when Elijah walked out onto it, the room rose to their feet, not in celebration, but in solidarity. A long, heavy silence followed, thick with reverence. He stood there for a moment, letting the stillness speak first. When he finally addressed the crowd, his voice was calm, low, but carried the weight of a man who had not only been bruised, but refused to let the bruise fade into forgetfulness. He didn't tell the story again. They already knew it. Instead, he spoke of responsibility, of how justice couldn't begin and end with viral moments, of how it lived in policy, in training rooms, in court transcripts, and in the quiet decisions made when no cameras were rolling. He spoke of the boy who wrote him the letter. Of the obligation to build a city where that boy could grow into a man and not have to learn how to brace for being mistaken for danger. The audience didn't erupt in applause. They absorbed it, eyes shining, heads nodding. Some with tears, some with clenched jaws. Later, as the summit transitioned into breakout sessions, Elijah found himself approached by a group of young men from East Highland High, a school notorious for its underfunding and over-policing. One of them, maybe 17, eyes sharp and shoulders square with defiance, stood in front of him and asked, "Did you think about quitting when it happened to you? Did you want to just leave it all behind?" Elijah didn't respond right away. He looked at the boy, looked past the hardness in his stare, and saw the fear underneath, the hope he was trying so hard to suppress. "Every part of me wanted to walk away," Elijah said. "Not just from the job, but from believing that it was worth anything at all. Because for a moment it felt like the system had spit me out, just like it's done to so many. But I stayed, not because I trust the system. I stayed because I know the people it fails, and I won't let it forget us." The boy nodded once, not wide-eyed or reassured, but grounded. Seen. As they left, another of the students turned and said, "We'll remember that." Outside, the summit had sparked new urgency. Local news ran stories not just about Elijah's speech, but about the reforms now underway. A civilian oversight board with teeth, transparent complaint procedures. A review of traffic stop patterns broken down by race and neighborhood. But real change still moved like wet concrete. Elijah knew this. For every inch gained, the resistance doubled in shadows. Whispers of retaliation, passive obstruction. Officers who turned cold, now seeing him not as one of their partners in justice, but as a traitor who had exposed their blind spots. He accepted it, not out of pride, but purpose. One morning, weeks after the summit, Elijah arrived early to the courthouse. He stood on the front steps, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the stone walls gold. The city was quieter in those hours, as if still deciding what kind of day it wanted to be. A janitor sweeping the entrance paused to say, "Good morning." A young intern hustled past and gave him a quick smile. Things hadn't healed, not fully, but there were moments, glimpses of something shifting. And in those moments, Elijah felt the weight of his choices. He hadn't set out to become a symbol. He had only wanted to do his job, to serve the law. But life had handed him a wound, and in choosing to show it, to name it, he had given the city permission to look at its own. Officer Mills resigned quietly, without ceremony or press, slipping out through the back door of a department that no longer defended him. The Internal Affairs report, now public, listed procedural violations and bias indicators with clinical precision, but for many, it still felt like a footnote to a wound that ran deeper than policy. Elijah read the report alone in his office, the final pages resting on his lap as dusk settled outside his window. He felt no triumph, just the ache of what it had taken to get there. Meanwhile, across the city, communities that had long felt silenced saw the first signs of acknowledgement. Police cadets now underwent bias training developed in part by civil rights attorneys. A neighborhood review board began investigating complaints that once disappeared into filing cabinets. And still, Elijah moved through each day with cautious hope, knowing progress didn't undo harm. It only showed that harm could no longer be hidden without consequence. On the anniversary of the incident, Elijah stood beneath a mural painted on the side of a once abandoned building, a portrait of himself, not in a suit or courtroom, but mid-stride in the rain, wrists bruised, eyes forward. Around him, the community gathered, not for protest this time, but remembrance. Orders thought off. Children played nearby, elders spoke softly, and the same boy who once wrote Elijah that letter now stood beside him. Taller, voice steadier, preparing for college. A local jazz trio played in the distance, their notes rising like prayers. Elijah said few words, letting the space speak louder than speeches ever could. What had started as a moment of humiliation had grown into something larger, something unplanned but enduring. The city hadn't changed overnight, but it had looked itself in the mirror and refused to look away. And Elijah, once just a name in a headline, had become the quiet force behind a movement that reminded everyone justice wasn't a destination, but a direction worth walking toward together. Across 10 powerful keynotes, we've witnessed a journey far greater than one man's wrongful arrest. We've walked with Elijah not just through the rain-soaked streets of humiliation, but into the blaze of public reckoning, internal war, and a rising call for systemic reform. This was more than a tragic misunderstanding. It was a litmus test for how deeply racial bias still runs through the arteries of justice. From the shocking moment of his arrest to the quiet strength of foe.
His resolve, Elijah became more than a victim. He became a vessel, a voice for the unseen, a mirror held up to institutions that too often choose blindness. We watched as he refused to be silenced, using the very tools meant to shame him. His bruised wrists, his silenced ID, his righteous anger as instruments of change. And yet this story was never just about Elijah. It was about every boy watching, wondering if success could shield them. Every woman filing complaints that go unanswered. Every voice that's been muted under the weight of mistaken identity. It's about how the system must change not only in words, but in practice, in policy, and in purpose. Justice is not a position, it's a pursuit. And Elijah reminded us all, being lawful is not always enough to be safe, but standing in truth, unflinching, unashamed, can move a city. Thank you for walking this road with a one storyteller. If this story moved you, share it, speak it, and carry its weight into the world. Because stories like this aren't just told, they lived, and they deserve to echo. Stay watching, stay awake, stay with us.